there is a risk that the largesse from the federal government, which is very much appreciated in this moment of crisis, will allow the state to continue some of the bad habits that it's had over many decades. People have heard me talk about the inability of the state to increase the gas tax. In fact, since 1991, it's gone up just 3 cents. So that's 14% since 1991. And in that same period of time, MBTA fares are up 250% or more. And so we're getting things wrong at the state level. And we need to be clear with the state legislature that, yes, we want federal dollars, but we can't use them as an excuse for further inaction in Massachusetts. And we can't just double down on the status quo, because we know as the economy comes back, if we just double down, we're going to get even more congestion, even more air pollution and carbon emissions, unsafe roads and streets and sidewalks, all the things that we've had for 20 or 30 years now that we don't want. And frankly, we're hoping to leave in the past as we get into recovery.
Welcome, everyone, to our first virtual Street Talk. As the Livable Streets Alliance, I want to say thank you to the WGBH Forum for being our host for tonight's event. And yeah, I just want to say thank you for being excited and willing participants. You know, Livable Streets is doing this with partners. And so before I explain to you what we're doing here tonight, I also want to thank the Pioneer Valley Planning Council and Transportation for Massachusetts for being our co-host tonight. We do have folks from Worcester, from all over the state who've registered. I also saw some colleagues from Ohio, from Tennessee. We have national participation, and it's in part because of our great partnerships. And so what I want to do is turn things over for just a minute to my partner in state advocacy, Chris Dempsey, who is the Director of Transportation for Massachusetts. And yeah, I'm gonna let you take it over from here, Chris.
Great, thank you, Stacy. It's fantastic to be part of the conversation tonight, and thank you to WGBH for producing this and to Livable Streets for leading this forum. I'm excited for the conversation tonight, but also for the Street Talk forums that will follow in the coming weeks. So great job pulling these together. We're in a strange and unsettling time for a lot of people, and one where we're being reminded of the value of government and political leadership and sound public policy. And so it's my honor tonight to introduce our two special guests who represent the best of public service. Now, normally I'd ask the audience to hold its applause until the end of the introductions, but in this case, those watching from home should probably hold your applause entirely, as we don't want to startle any small children or household pets that may be in your vicinity. So here we go. First is Beth Osborne, who is the Director of Transportation for America. Beth has had an impressive career making an impact in Washington, D.C., including stints as a staffer in both the House and the Senate on Capitol Hill, and as a senior member of the U.S. DOT in the Obama administration, where she served as the Acting Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy and managed the famed Tiger Discretionary Grant Program. We are all looking forward to the future Netflix documentary, Tiger Queen, which will chronicle her time at US DOT. I've known Beth for a few years now, and every time I talk to her, I learn something new and am deeply impressed with her knowledge and understanding of US federal transportation policy, but also her vision for what the future of transportation and mobility can and should look like across the country. So thank you, Beth, for joining the discussion tonight. And our other special guest is Congresswoman Katherine Clark. Congresswoman Clark has served since 2013 and represents the diverse district comprised of 24 cities and towns that stretch from Revere and Winthrop all the way across the northern suburbs of Boston to Metro West communities such as Ashland and Framingham. I was fortunate to work with Congresswoman Clark briefly in 2006 before she was elected as a state rep and then a state senator. But it was clear to all of us back then that whatever she decided to do in public life, she was going to be a leader. And just one piece of evidence of that is that in the fall of 2018, she was chosen by her colleagues to serve as the vice chair of the Democratic caucus, making her the 6th highest ranking Democrat in Congress. And that's an exceptionally rare achievement for someone who has served in Congress for less than a decade, and a true recognition of the respect that her colleagues have for her. So thank you so much, Congresswoman Clark, for joining us tonight during such a critical period, and we're grateful for your time. We know that you need to leave a little bit before the end of the program, but we appreciate that you're able to make some time for us to share your perspective. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Stacey Thompson, and I look forward to joining the conversation later in the program.
Yep. Thank you so much, Chris. And yeah, I wanna kick it off with Beth and Congresswoman Clark. Again, thank you. And the first question I have, which is I think a question on everyone's mind, is so what is it like in Washington right now? Before we even get into the nitty gritty of this question, I'd love for you to share a little bit about what it has been like the last month and what really went into the most recent stimulus package, specifically the CARES Act.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the question. I thank WGBH for putting this together. Chris, thank you. It is good to see you virtually. And we appreciate all the work of Transportation for Massachusetts and Beth with Transportation for America. It's incredible. And we all need street talk. We're all looking for that connection, a way not to just look out our windows, very excited if somebody happens to come to the door. You know, thank you for putting this together on this really important topic. One of the most notable things about being in Washington is that we're not in Washington, and trying to put together what our constituents need, what our country needs from our home offices, with all the same snafus and problems that everyone else is having, with new technologies and new ways of connecting. But the work is so critical. And it started back in March, where we put together our first package. What we hope to pass tomorrow in the House is going to be an interim emergency package, but it really builds on the CARES Act. And that is my light that you have to move to. So if I speak too quietly, it will go off again. But what we did was try and shape what the Senate gave us as House Democrats into a bill that really put workers first and families at home as the priority. And we answered that by getting $150 billion in state and local aid that goes to first responders, supporting the healthcare, the food, the homeless programs that are falling on our states and falling on our first responders and local municipalities in their incredible response to this pandemic. Then we really looked at workers, putting $200 billion into extended unemployment benefits, making sure that everyone was covered, even people who typically couldn't collect unemployment, like gig employees, contract workers, people who have filed 1099s and wouldn't usually be able to collect unemployment, but now can. We also put together direct cash payments because we know that the bills aren't waiting for many of these programs to kick in, and that people needed our help. There's also a large, almost $400 billion, $375 billion in small business programs and loaning, $200 billion for hospitals and research, and perhaps most importantly to this discussion, $25 billion for transit, that make sure that we are able to cover the payrolls for different transit employees in this time. That translated for Massachusetts into $1 billion in aid for our transit programs. And unfortunately, in the interim program, interim bill that we're going to be voting on in the House tomorrow, there is not an expansion of that. But we're really looking already towards next steps and what we can do to increase support for transportation and infrastructure as we go forward. I think the most exciting thing about tomorrow's bill is that we fought and were able to achieve a $25 billion investment in additional testing. Without the testing and tracing, we are not going to be able to get our handle on this public health crisis, and therefore we can't resolve our economic crisis. And we know how much it means that we have to do both, and we have to make this plan for testing and tracing across the country to be able to reopen as safely and as quickly as possible. So it will be a lonely plane ride, I'm sure, to Washington tomorrow, but we're looking forward to getting there, to putting this next piece of help for Americans in place, and a chance to be back in the Capitol in whatever the new normal is going to be in Washington.
Awesome. Thank you. And I don't want a little tidbit to get lost. And this is I'm gonna have things transition to Beth. I don't know if folks who are watching recognize this, but this is the first time in American history that the federal government has actually designated operating funds for a transit system in a stimulus package. It's actually, just a few days before this package was being built, there were $0. And thanks to leadership from people like you and from people like Beth, we made history. And we're sort of not recognizing how huge that sea shift is. And so I want to turn things over to Beth for a minute just to help the audience understand, like, what is in this package for transportation? What did we get? What does it do? What does it not do? And we're gonna have time later to get into the nitty gritty, but just like set the stage.
Yeah, sure. It's wild because so much of life and advocacy in Washington, D.C., and I think everywhere, feels like you're banging your head up against a wall until, and hoping the wall cracks before your head does. And I spent a lot of my career doing that. This was the most rewarding 2.5 weeks of my career in total. It went from March 10th, when I read an article in the paper, in the Washington Post, talking about the potential for the Trump administration to send all federal workers home to telework. And I immediately thought, in the shutdown that we had in the past, that has been really rough on our transit system. And this is going to be way more devastating. And then I thought, oh my gosh, Seattle's transit system must already be in the soup, and MTA in New York. And then we started asking around, and it wasn't getting as much focus as some of the other issues. And there was, the typical role of the federal government in the transit program is the feds pay for building transit. And the notion is that we then hand things over to the localities to operate and maintain them. And I think that we were gearing up, we were still working within that world when we teamed up with organizations like Transportation for Massachusetts, but also Transit Center out of New York City. And we were able to put together a lot of good information about how many essential workers depend on transit. 36% of typical transit riders are essential workers now. And even if you don't ride transit, getting to the hospital in your own personal automobile doesn't benefit you that much if the nurse doesn't get there too. So we all are transit dependent right now. And what was super exciting was the overwhelmingly positive response we got from Congress on both sides of the Hill, in the Senate and the House, and on both sides of the aisle. Transit has not always been an overwhelmingly bipartisan issue, and transit operations has typically had bipartisan opposition, and that was not the case. Folks really got it, and it went from an idea on the 10th of March to $20 billion in the Senate bill and $25 billion in the House bill, and they negotiated the bigger number. And this is super flexible dollars going out to transit agencies across the country to spend in any way they need to fill the gap, which unfortunately still is not going to be enough. Transit Center found a need for $26 to $38 billion to truly fill the gap, and that's not even fully considering the loss in local revenues and state taxes as well. But it's an incredible start to keep the systems operating so the people we need to be at work are there when we need them.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. And I'm going to ask you a bunch of follow-up questions. I've already got some coming in from the audience, but I want to shift gears a little bit, because people who are paying attention are like, "Ooh, we got $1 billion. Great, that seems like a lot of money." But in Massachusetts, that's like just kind of enough for our regional transit authorities and the MBTA to sort of keep things moving. So I'm going to turn things back to you, Rep. Clark, and just lean on your experience. As Chris mentioned, you were a state rep and a state senator. You know how tough state budgets are. And beyond transportation, but especially around transportation, for years, we have underfunded our roads, our bridges, and our transit as a state. And I know this is true for our colleagues across the country. They're facing the same thing. We're like, well, we're keeping the lights on, but that doesn't fix our problems. And now there's this fear that it's going to get worse, that we're going to compound these problems. And so I'm going to ask you, what's next? What are you and your colleagues in Washington thinking about in terms of filling these gaps in the future and helping us get beyond this panic mode. What can you do at the federal level to help with some of these statewide questions?
Yeah, I think we all share that concern, as this pandemic shows so many of the fault lines that we knew were there, whether they are about social justice, access to healthcare, and certainly public transportation is one of those. And we know that we have underinvested in this crucial resource, and that it will be a crucial tool to getting our economy going again. So while we are going down tomorrow to vote on a rather narrow package that we were able to negotiate over 2 weeks, some critical but smaller extensions, we are also putting together 2 other packages that will include funding for transportation. And one is basically another expansion of the CARES Act, going back, looking at more money for transit, and also having our eye on a bigger investment bill that can really look at where we need to go for infrastructure in this country. And that this would be a very good time to make the kind of investment and the size of investment that we just haven't been able to find the political will to do. But now we can really achieve not only great things for our infrastructure, but we can also do it in a way that can help create jobs. And we are hoping that this will be something that the White House and the Republicans in the Senate will join us on. And we'll be leaning on Beth and her powerful skills of negotiation to make sure that the issues that we all care about around transportation, that safety is a priority, that access, that those continue to be markers that we are working towards, and that we can build on some of the work that's already been done. We put out a framework in the House back in the winter, and we want to continue to expand on that. I think when we have such a devastating experience for people in the loss of life that they're experiencing, the anxiety around this, and also the economic and financial hardship that they're going through, we have to take this time to try and come out better. And transportation, investment in infrastructure, helping our states and cities weather this storm, all these areas that are underfunded, I think is our time to look at it. And I hope we can be more in the New Deal mindset when we finally get back to legislating around these bigger areas than we have been in the past. We've seen how much it means. We've seen the impact of this kind of natural disaster, and we have to be ready. And having our infrastructure is going to be a key piece of our economic recovery and a key piece of making sure we're ready to address the next public health crisis.
Great. Thank you. We're gonna talk later with the audience about how they can be supportive / do lots of outreach to you and your colleagues around these bills in the future. But I want to quickly flip back to Beth, and then I'm going to give you one more question, Rep. And I know you're busy, but before I get there, I think it's a really valuable time to learn from the 2009 Recovery Act, right? We have been in a moment about a little over a decade ago when we had an economic downturn and there was stimulus, and a lot of money was infused into transportation projects. And so what I'd love to ask you, Beth, I know that Transportation for America recently released a report learning from that Recovery Act. What are, the top 2 or 3 things that we need to be thinking about as we go into sort of the next phase of stimulus and potentially funding some big transportation infrastructure stuff?
Yeah, I appreciate you raising that. In 2008, when we saw the economy take a dive last time, I was actually in the Senate at the time and was part of the bipartisan team that was negotiating the Recovery Act. I then went to the U.S. Department of Transportation and participated in the implementation of it. So I got to hear a good deal on what was working and what wasn't working. And since then, there's been a lot of study. And there's a couple of things that we learned. There's really 2 big top issues. One is certain projects create more jobs per dollar than others, but the stimulus was not focused on getting money to those projects. It was focused on distributing money equitably amongst the states and not necessarily focusing on the projects that would create the most jobs quickly. So we know that transit projects create more jobs than highway jobs, both in the short run and the long run. We know that roadway state of repair creates significantly more jobs per dollar spent than roadway and highway expansion projects, because when you expand a highway or you build a new highway, you have to acquire a lot of right-of-way. And while there will be many appreciative lawyers who get jobs in the property exchange, it's not really the economic stimulus we're looking for in creating a lot of new construction and activity in that community. And the Recovery Act did not focus money in those areas. I think the other big thing we found out is Congress was in a rush because we were in the midst of a great economic challenge. And being in a rush, also not wanting to take on any more negotiating than you have to, already pulling together a huge bill. What they did was default to the existing programs, which is totally understandable. The problem is the existing programs are not designed to create jobs in mass number or quickly. The existing transportation program is to equitably distribute dollars for states and transit agencies to figure out how to manage their transportation networks over the long run. And just because you put a lot of money through that does not mean it changes the outcomes that the program was designed to create. And immediate job creation simply isn't one of those outcomes. So if we repeat that, while we might build some interesting projects, it will be over 10 to 12 years and not stimulus. So I hope Congress learns from that. And while it will be harder to negotiate new programs or tweak old programs, it will be required if the goal is short-term stimulus. I will also just say we probably should watch our language about what we're trying to seek. So projects that were ready to go right before the COVID crisis might not be responsive to our needs today. And we need to think about what are the projects people need right now in the midst. We've now highlighted all kinds of problems with our cities that are needing a lot of space for people to keep social distance. And we're seeing probably a long-term economic challenge that is not going to lead to the same traffic loads that we were expecting. So maybe a massive highway expansion to deal with future traffic is not well timed right now. Maybe a project that we weren't considering to make more space for people out of doors while they'll continue social distance is. So ready to go 2 months ago, this should not be the goal. And finally, shovel ready is a concerning phrase, because what we might need to do might be paint ready and a redesign, not necessarily turning dirt.
Great. So Beth knows what we need to do. And I'm going to ask you one more question, Congresswoman Clark. It's building off what you said previously about trying to work with your colleagues. And, infrastructure has traditionally been something that Republicans and Democrats get along and do, but we haven't seen a big infrastructure bill since 2016. And so my question to you is, what do you think the prospects of actually doing a big federal reauthorization bill between now and November are? And should we wait? Should we focus on stimulus now and then focus on, the job generation around infrastructure maybe a little bit later? Your best guess right now?
It is hard to guess. And the exact timing, I'm not sure of, but I think that we all want to push that, as I was saying, that we seize this moment. However much we wish that this moment had never occurred, to make some of the investments that we know we have to make. And I think that Beth's caution is a good one. Let's remain flexible. What was teed up for a reauthorization coming in June, many of those projects could be folded into a bigger recovery bill. I think that is very likely to happen. But we want to make sure that if we have an opportunity to have a $2 trillion investment in infrastructure, and that includes things like, broadband, which this pandemic has certainly highlighted the need for that. It would include looking at our harbors. I hope it includes looking at childcare and infrastructure needs of childcare. But we have to look at the projects that are going to create jobs, that are going to help us for our other impending climate change, and how we really prepare ourselves through renewable energy and other infrastructure jobs to address that natural disaster as well, and how we can take this moment to make sure that we are making the right plans, that we are meeting this moment with the right investments. And I'm hopeful. The president keeps speaking about that he would do $2 trillion in investment, and we know that is a bouncing ball that is hard to track, but I think there's an opportunity here, and we're gonna need everybody on this call. We're gonna need our best minds in transportation to be thinking about how we can tackle some of the problems that have been so hard to solve and so hard to get the funding that is needed. We do have that chance. I know that Peter DeFazio and others are putting together a very large comprehensive bill. It doesn't mean anybody is shut out of their ideas or ways of looking at it that could improve it. And we do have to keep looking at solutions that are evolving as we address this pandemic. But it's an exciting opportunity, and I hope that transportation and public transit and this sector is going to be playing the role in our recovery that we need it to be, and to be finally able to make those investments in the size and do it smartly. We're using these phrases, build it smart, safe, and build it to last. And those are sort of our guideposts. And I think that we just need to work together to address this public health crisis and really turn to the infrastructure needs of this country as an area that can help us get back on our feet as a country and really build the future that we all want and that we deserve for our children. So thank you for your work. Thank you.
I know, sorry, I know you have to leave us. I appreciate you giving us a half hour of your time tonight, especially when you literally need to go to Washington to vote on another stimulus bill. Everyone who's in this room should feel very privileged that we got a half hour of your time. And I often say, everyone says transportation is dominated by men, but it's the women that are making the change. So thank you. And we're gonna let you sneak out. What's gonna happen next for folks in the room is that Beth and I'm gonna rapid fire with Beth for about 10 minutes. And I'm gonna make her tell us all the answers to things. And then we're gonna turn things over to Bob, a reporter at WGBH, who's going to ask Beth and Chris and I a few questions to put us on the spot, and then I'm going to dig into audience Q&A. But as I get into this first question, I just want to acknowledge that, I'm getting a lot of questions from the audience around what about all this pavement? Shouldn't we be having open streets now? What about funding transit? All of these things that we value. I can't even go through all of the questions. And I think that it leads really well into this question I want to ask you, which is what the heck is this transportation reauthorization bill that we're talking about? What is the history and legacy of it? Just outside of stimulus, help this audience understand why we're sort of stuck here today.
Sure. I mean, folks probably remember back in the 50s that President Eisenhower, who had been, a big part of World War II, had seen the Autobahn in Germany and wanted to build something like that in the U.S. And he came back, and as president, we created our highway program. And several decades later, when Ronald Reagan was in office, he wanted to he didn't love the idea of raising the gas tax, but he knew that we needed to. And the way he struck the deal to raise the gas tax so we could build more highways was to dedicate a portion of the new funding to transit. And I would say that that's where the progress in the program ended. So what we have now is a 1982 program designed to share funding for states, and state DOTs designed themselves around that, that kind of focus, and created their programs to support it. So we pay for our transportation, our surface transportation program, with an 18.4 cent per gallon gas tax. It's included in your retail price. And that money is brought to Washington and then redistributed through a formula that isn't worth going into, but just know it has a little bit to do with population and how many lane miles of highway you have and how much gasoline is bought in your state, things like that. And that money is extremely flexible, with 80% of it dedicated to building highways and 20% of it dedicated to build transit. So where are we? We are in one of our cycles to quote, reauthorize the program, to re-up it. We do that every 5 to 8 years. A lot of members of Congress who were there last time we reauthorized aren't there anymore, because 5 to 8 years is quite a long time between reauthorizations. And as a result, I fear that we kind of keep the status quo going. Why is it called stimulus? Is there's a notion of creating more construction jobs by doing more construction. However, our current program is not designed to get projects to ground quickly. It is to manage over the long run a transportation program. So it doesn't do that very well.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you. And so just to connect the dots for some folks in the audience, just because I'm seeing some of the questions that are coming, the stimulus money that came in the CARES Act that will go towards state and local governments, that's the money we could access to ask for better infrastructure locally in a number of ways. Some of the very specific things you're asking for, like widening sidewalks, et cetera, et cetera. The current formula for this transportation infrastructure package is sort of a legacy bill that we keep reauthorizing. It's like a horror movie that we keep getting sequels to. And so if you're wondering why we can't fund transit, that's kind of where we're at. And now there's this excitement, at least as I understand it, to maybe use this as stimulus, right? To say, oh, here's lots and lots of money, let's get it out the door. And so I want to ask you a follow-up question, and then we got to turn things over in like 2 minutes. So I'm going to pile them on for you. But it's okay. So we talked about stimulus versus this. We have a lot of folks on this call who are not from the Boston metro area. And I wanted to ask you, there's a perception that cities and urban areas get all of the transportation resources and rural areas get cut out. We have some ideas about how to fix that in Massachusetts, but can you talk about sort of not just balancing resetting so that we're focusing on walking, biking, transit, green, renewable things, but also the balance between people who are in rural and urban areas and how they're helped or hurt right now with the current formula?
Yeah, this is an issue that is that comes up in a lot of programs, definitely every time we reauthorize the bill. And I will tell you, my great concern about sticking reauthorization and stimulus is all we do is re-ensconce a 40-year-old program into existence, and we use a vast amount of resources, we're hearing in the trillions, to pour out projects that are created in the 1982 mold. And that might be theoretical stimulus in terms of creating some construction jobs, but it can also be quite damaging because we're not addressing today's issues, and we could be doing some damage. I'd almost rather see us pay people to dig holes and fill them back up, because that will do less damage. In terms of rural and urban, I think one thing that's really important is absolutely everybody feels like they are being ignored by this program. You cannot go to a city of any size or a town of any size without them saying somebody else is getting the money. That is partially because we haven't kept up with need. It is partially because we haven't helped people focus on ways to build projects that address multiple needs at once. We're still in a world of 1982 where we're building things out, and as long as we accomplish one thing with one project, that's good enough. And I think that we need to get better about making sure every project does lots of things. I will also say, for those of you in those rural towns, when we talk about rural in Washington, D.C., they're not thinking about you. They're thinking about the great wide open. they kind of forget there are people in rural America and that they live in towns. And what's interesting is those rural towns often have more in common with the cities than they do with the great wide open. But the folks defending rural needs are thinking about building things where no one lives. So that's something we're going to have to fight back on and remind them there are actual communities that need an investment that generates local economic growth, not something out in a cornfield that might generate a future community.
Thanks. You have strong opinions on it. Okay, I'm going to ask you one more twofold question, and then while you're answering, we'll invite Chris and Bob back on so that they can jump right in and turn the tables. But my last question is twofold. Okay, we already heard that infrastructure is sort of a popular bipartisan issue, and that Democrats and Republicans get along, but they get it wrong. So who is a shining light? Like, who is working on this in Washington? You know, is there hope? And then we've gotten a lot of questions. I got multiple questions from folks who signed up in advance about, like, so what can we do about it, right? Like, it's really easy to look at the street in front of your house and pick on the mayor, but what can people do? So is there hope? Who's doing it? And what should people on this call keep in mind? And then we're gonna shift to Bob and then audience Q&A.
Great questions. I am an incredible cynic, but I am a cynic who is an optimist. So I believe that we can change the world, and I'm always looking out for who's going to get in my way. And so, yes, of course we can change things. And I think that we should keep that hope alive. The Congresswoman who was just on the call is clearly open to some of these things. You can tell by the way she laid out her priorities. I heard safety. I heard access. People who talk about transportation in terms of access are talking about a whole different way of accomplishing transportation ends than the typical way of talking about it, which is terms mobility. When people talk about mobility, the translation of that is moving cars quickly. And whether or not you arrive is incidental. The only question is whether, when I look at a window in a highway, is that traffic moving? When they talk about access, they're talking about whether or not you can get to your destination. That is a complete sea change. And anytime you hear people talking about that, that is a good sign. I'd also just like to mention the Future of Transportation Caucus, which was put together by Representatives Presley from the Boston area, Representative Takano, who is from Southern California, and Representative Garcia from Chicago. And they have put forward the big priorities of fixing the existing system before we build onto it. And if we build onto it, let's make sure we have a plan to keep it in repair. Making the system safer, especially for our most vulnerable users, which are those that are outside of a car. And access, making sure people can access jobs and daily necessities like the grocery and schools and medical facilities and banks and all of those things. And these are the priorities that Transportation for America is seeking as well.
Awesome. Well, Beth, thank you for letting me grill you. We're going to take a step back and turn it over to Bob C. At WGBH. Chris, thanks for hopping back in. We expect you to have all the answers for our state transportation woes. So Bob, take it away.
All right, Beth, I'd like to talk about the huge...
Oop. See, this is one of those...
Think carefully about how we spend it. Back in the 10 years ago, after the recession, there was a lot of, the stimulus bill provided a lot of money, but people were rushing into projects. And in many cases, they weren't working out because they were trying to do it too quickly. So what about thinking, making sure we have enough time, and who's going to be helping us think through those priorities?
That is such a great question. I do not have all the answers to it. But I think if we look at focusing on the projects we know will create the most jobs the fastest, that can at least give us a lens of focus, which can help folks. And then it won't require quite as much oversight. The nice thing about a state of repair project as opposed to a big expansion project is it can go to ground much faster. You don't have to acquire land. You don't have to do as much environmental remediation and analysis. It can just happen much faster. faster. And especially since we expect traffic loads are going to be lower for a while, doing state of repair projects now is less disruptive. So there's great opportunity to just focus things in areas that we know can accomplish our goals and can be done more easily. But I also think you make a very good point. This is not an easy thing to do. Departments of Transportation have a fiscally constrained program. So it's not like they have hundreds of projects ready to go that they had no idea how to fund before. And if there is a DOT that's done that, it's not a very responsible DOT. So we really don't want to reward them with tons of money to go build all these things that they irresponsibly created without any idea and spent money to create and prepare that they had no idea that they could ever build. So staffing up and preparing is tough, but we are learning things right now. Cities are doing things right now with paint and bollards and redesigning roads. And we can do a lot more of that to react to circumstances on the ground that could be very helpful in terms of weathering, what's going to be an ongoing storm.
Well, taking a look at the big picture, we have done a lot of work here in Massachusetts looking at rail vision, and it's a very expensive prospect. Electrifying the rail, really making it more frequent. It's really one of the most exciting opportunities, I think, to decrease traffic and move people a lot more easily. Is this money, do you think, going to be available for that kind of thing? And what does the state have to do in order to make sure it gets some of it?
That is a very, very good question. I do think that there's likely to be some funding particularly focused on rail. Hard to know how much. And part of that is going to require groups like mine and Transportation for Massachusetts and Stacy's Livable Streets folks and all the folks who care about these issues to be a little disruptive. I referred earlier to this notion that 80% of money goes to roads and 20% goes to transit based on a deal that Ronald Reagan made with the House in 1982. And that now has the power of, the word of God now. And so Congress rather instinctually applies it, but it's based on a user fee where the driver's paying a gas tax. There won't be a penny of gas tax in this bill, and being fair to the user fee payer doesn't make any sense. So we kind of have to get them to think more freely and think about, like, why shouldn't transit get as much money of the roads? Why shouldn't it get more? Why shouldn't we focus on, like in 1956, we built the interstate system. Let's go build a national rail system now. It is not instinctual for Congress to think that way. And it's going to take us to push them to do that.
I have a question for Chris. As you're certainly aware, Chris, we were on the verge of making a lot of advances in transportation funding here in Massachusetts. Where are we at now, especially with the amount of federal money that may be coming in? What is that going to do? Is that going to disincentivize the legislature to come up with the money that we eventually may need?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob, and put me down as someone who is still optimistic that we will see some good legislation come out of the State House this year. It may be far scaled down from what we were hoping before the crisis, but there are still opportunities in the budget and in the transportation bond bill to get some good policy in there that will set us up for the future. But you're absolutely right that there is a risk that the largesse from the federal government, which is very much appreciated in this moment of crisis, will allow the state to continue some of the bad habits that it's had over many decades. People have heard me talk about the inability of the state to increase the gas tax. In fact, since 1991, it's gone up just 3 cents. So that's 14% since 1991. And in that same period of time, MBTA fares are up 250% or more. And so we're getting things wrong at the state level. And we need to be clear with the state legislature that, yes, we want federal dollars, but we can't use them as an excuse for further inaction in Massachusetts. And we can't just double down on the status quo, because we know as the economy comes back, if we just double down, we're going to get even more congestion, even more air pollution and carbon emissions, unsafe roads and streets and sidewalks, all the things that we've had for 20 or 30 years now that we don't want. And frankly, we're hoping to leave in the past as we get into recovery. So there is a risk there, and organizations like ours and people watching from home need to be vigilant about that and continue to push the legislature.
And one last question I have for Stacy. We have all this wonderful space on our streets now. Challenging to use it, challenging to be 6 feet away from everyone else, and challenging to just go out for the essential travel we need. What are the chances that we can preserve some of that space and transform it into making our streets more livable as we move out of this crisis?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob. And it actually echoes what some folks in the audience have brought up. And I would say a few things. You know, today a cyclist was struck and killed on our streets in Boston, right outside of Boston Medical Center. As I said a couple of weeks ago, the last thing that our emergency rooms need right now are crash victims. And we are seeing an increase in speeding on our streets. But you know, what I would say is, much like Beth's advice to Congress to not just like run to what you know, like open all the streets, that doesn't quite work in social distancing. And so what we are saying, what I think makes sense in the short and long term, is we know in Massachusetts where the hotspots are. It's our communities of color. And they are also the communities that have the worst sidewalks, that have the least transit access. And we need to be putting our resources, the tools in our toolkits today to make sure that our essential workers, our most impacted people, have what they need. And that's more than street space, right? It's a complex ecosystem of walking, biking, and transit needs. And we need to really rethink how we prioritize those things today. But to get to some of these other questions, the question you ask is, we need that space, whether a pandemic had hit or not. You know, the worst case scenario right now is that people are scared to get back on transit and they get in their cars. And so I'm going to make a pitch for the next 2 street talks. The next one is entirely focused on what we do on our streets. And the one after that is entirely focused on what we do with transit. We're going to get into these pieces, but I would say, like, we do have to maintain social distance. We do need to keep some of that street space. But that's not a new question. That's not new. That is the same problem we had in January and February and March, and is the same problem we will have in April and May and June. We just need to think differently about our priorities at this moment.
And perhaps the federal money will free up some more state and local money for the streets projects, which might happen. Anyway, thank you for inviting me, and it was a great opportunity to meet Beth and ask her some questions, and see Chris as well. Thank you.
And thanks for letting me jump in and have my own opinions, which is cool.
Okay.
So what I'm going to do now in the last 10 minutes or so is turn over some of these audience questions. And I will just say to folks, a lot of people have questions about what happens on our streets, specific questions around transit. And I would say, do come to the next Street Talks. We're planning on like in the same way Beth went real deep. We're going to do that on each of these topics. So if you are really hungry for that content, come back in the next 2 weeks. But in the meantime, you know, I'm just going through these. We have covered some of them already, but there is this question around, you know, we are going to need social distancing on mass transit to restart the economy. Like, we need to get people on transit, but we're going to need space. We're going to need PPEs. We're going to need more frequent buses and trains to handle this new sense of crowding and the new volume, and that there needs to be more transportation resources per capita, meaning higher funding. And so, if for a person in the audience, you know, I'm reading off of a couple of questions that came through along these lines. What should they be asking for? Like, you know, knowing that, what is the message to their elected officials?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. I think that is such a great point. We're going to need more social distancing everywhere. We are not getting out of this social distancing thing for the foreseeable future. We could be in it for 2 years or more. I certainly hope it's not that long, but there's a lot that our reopening is not going back to how it was. And so we need to rethink the way we are using our funds. I think, Stacy, what you said is very, very important. What COVID has done is put a spotlight on a problem that always existed. It didn't unveil a new problem. This has been a problem for decades. So I think making space on transit, you know, one of the odd things about our policy to date has been that crowded roads are considered a failure, but wide open roads are a big success, roads that nobody uses. Wide open transit, though, is a failure, and crowded transit is the only thing that's a success. Packing people on the bus like they're sardines is the only way we can justify their existence. Maybe things have shifted now that we recognize that we're all transit dependent because, like I said earlier, it's no good to drive yourself to the hospital if there's nobody there to take care of you. And so maybe we can do exactly what the questioner asked, which is put more money into it so there's space on buses so that, frankly, they're just more comfortable, and more healthy. Period. It's not like this is the first time that there was any sort of virus that got people sick. Maybe we can just stop shoving people onto the bus. And what they should ask for, I think it's more important to recognize what the current program delivers and point out how you need something different. The current program delivers fast moving roads. It is not smart. It is not safe. It is fast and it is big. And it is often heavily polluting and disruptive. So we need to point out to Congress that thinks that every transportation project is the greatest thing in the world and that the program delivers exactly what everybody wants, that it doesn't necessarily do so. And we want a program that delivers the things that we want.
Great. I'm going to ask the next question, a couple of questions together that both of you can answer. The first is near and dear to my heart. How do we get a nationwide moratorium on federal funding for building new and expanding highways? And then, you know, how do we get money to tear down highways? And, you know, there's another question in here that I think is great. Will investments for public transit and transportation infrastructure include health infrastructure and include preventative measures like the sanitation booths featured in Milan and Hanoi? And if for those of you who don't know, they're actual booths that sanitize you as you're getting on and off transit. And those are the kinds of things we haven't traditionally thought about using transportation funds for. So, you know, I would pitch this to both of you because I think that there's stuff we can do locally and there's stuff we can do nationally. So I don't care who goes first.
Let me jump in because I actually have, I think, what leads to a question for Beth. So I think historically, we have thought about federal transportation policy as having a goal of building the pie, creating the pie for transportation funding as large as possible. And that was sort of the first priority. And then it was about extracting as big a slice as we can for some of the things that we want, whether that's safe routes to school or whether that's a pretty modest transit program or set of projects. And that slice has always actually been really small relative to the much larger slice that goes to highway expansion. But we've treated that as a victory because, hey, we grew a big pie and then that meant our little slice is bigger. And I've always heard Beth speak eloquently about saying we need to really rethink that and not just focus on how big is the number and then how do we get our little slice, but fundamentally change the way that Congress thinks about that. And so I would ask that question to Beth, which is a variation of what you just asked, Stacey, is sort of how can we be effective at changing that perspective in Congress? Do we have any hope to do that, to get them to rethink that sort of status quo that they've had for now, what, 30 or 40 years?
Yeah, if you hear an organization say, you know, I want transit for funding and the price of getting funding for transit is to get 4 times as much funding for highways, don't listen to that group. If you are talking to a group that says, hey, we got $50 million to retrofit roads to make them safer for bicyclists and pedestrians, please don't pay attention to the fact that we're going to spend $50 billion to build new roads as badly as ever. Don't listen to that group. That is the trade-off we have made for 40 years, is I will accept a large pot of questionable funding if you give me a small pot of good funding. And the idea has always been it's a floor and we can build off of it, except it never turns into that. And after trying this for, you know, since my childhood, I think we should finally learn the message that we're being bought off cheaply. In terms of your other question, Stacey, we just did a poll with Transit Center and Data for Progress and some other partners. And what was interesting is a fix-it-first approach, which just that policy can slow down, if not end, new highway building. Because if you have to demonstrate that you've got your current system in a state of repair before you're permitted to build new stuff, and you can't build new stuff until you can prove you can operate and manage it like we require for transit, it's hard to build new stuff because so many people have done a poor job of keeping up with their state of repair needs. But the poll that we did found that there was overwhelming support for a fix-it-first approach. I mean, we're talking close to 80%, and there were 3 points difference between Republicans, Democrats, and independents, with Republicans supporting it the most. There was also more than 60% of the respondents who supported a 10-year moratorium on new roadway building in order to focus on maintaining the existing system we have. And again, more Republicans supported it than Democrats. This is overwhelmingly supported as good policy. We just have to convince our elected leaders that they need to catch up to people. Yeah. And the last thing, your last question about funding for unusual things like booths to put the drivers in, and ways to disinfect people who are boarding transit and things like that. I'm already seeing transit agencies try this all over the place. I was just talking with the Indianapolis transit system, and they've got a contract to build booths for all of their drivers on all of their buses immediately, like within a couple of weeks. Transit agencies are getting very creative and very thoughtful, and not just in terms of running transit well, but being good citizens of the community. One of the things they were talking about was getting an exemption to be able to replace their computers with federal dollars a year early so that they could donate their computers to students that don't have them. This is what transit agencies are trying to do, and it really is important that we learn from them and we empower them as much as possible.
Great. Thank you. And I'm going to end with one last question. I know we're at time, but it's not a good event unless you're a few minutes over, no matter how hard we try to keep things on time. And I'm going to, again, try to combine a few of these. And it's Earth Day today, which we didn't acknowledge at the top of the show, but we've had a number of questions. Sorry, one I missed earlier around, will these broader investments draw on the Green New Deal? And I'm going to interject and say the Green New Deal is actually really short on transit as a solution. That I think the question should be flipped and say, what the heck of a lot is missing in the Green New Deal that we should be advocating for? But then, we had a couple of other questions really about GHG emissions, around, the fact that we are in a climate crisis, and how do we connect these narratives for those of us who are geeky and understand this? We really know what's, this is like, Chris talks about this every day, but there still seems to be a disconnect where people don't see our roads, our bridges, our cars, our congestion as tied to climate. And so I will ask you both in closing on Earth Day about how do we tie these things more explicitly to our policies? How do we help people understand and actually make some progress on climate change? Chris?
Well, people have heard me say this before, but it's important to say it again. Transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Massachusetts and around the country. It's also the largest source of air pollution that causes asthma and heart disease and cardiovascular disease. And we're seeing actually a correlation between the COVID crisis and communities that are impacted by local air pollution. It's exposing some of that deep inequity that we have in our transportation system. I think we have some really good policies that can help address this. And one I'm excited about at the regional level is the Transportation and Climate Initiative. The beauty of that program is it's not going to require the federal government and Congress to get involved. It's being led by the governors of the states. And we're seeing, I think, in many states, and Massachusetts is one of them, and also New York, governors really stepping up and leading and also working together and trying to coordinate this crisis and the eventual opening of their economies. We hope they can continue that collaboration and coordination on something like the Transportation and Climate Initiative. But we are not going to address our climate crisis without addressing transportation, and policies like TCI, and then simple policies like let's build more transit, let's provide more options for walking and biking, let's get people into electric vehicles, are all things that are going to help improve our public health and improve that climate outlook.
I want to reemphasize that the Transportation and Climate Initiative is essential. People across the country are watching the Northeast to see how well they do here, and you all are the leaders, and so you're setting the stage for the rest of the country to think about ways to address transportation and climate. It is so essential that everybody engage in that effort. You are absolutely right, Stacy. The Green New Deal is frankly rather dismissive of the role that the built environment, the transportation system plays. The notion is everyone's going to get an electric vehicle and then they can go about their merry way, which means, 3 or 4 cars per household with a full family and driving further every year. All scientific evidence shows that EVs are absolutely essential and insufficient. We need to do more. We need to design a community where you can get to what you need without spending a ton of time in a car burning something. I mean, burning electricity has impacts as well. We're not going to be all renewable overnight. We're also not going to, in the midst of an economic decline, have a bunch of people replacing cars with a more expensive version. We have to recognize that. So what can we do now? I would like to refer folks to the Green New Deal for Transit, which is on our website and that we co-authored with Transit Center and some others, that lays out how the Green New Deal can be inclusive of the built environment. And then I will just point out that the beauty of addressing the transportation system and the community around you to allow you to do more by traveling less is that it also means you save money on transportation. You create a more equitable environment where those who don't have access to multiple cars for every single household can still be a big part of the economy. You also create safer communities where people can move around on their own. It has so much positive impact even beyond greenhouse gases. When I was in college in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I needed to get a job and I couldn't get to any job because I didn't have a car, but I couldn't afford a car because I didn't have a job. Telling me that I could get an EV would not have fixed that. We can create a less polluting transportation system that still solves my problem as a young student starting out.
Great. Well, I'm going to wrap our conversation. Beth, I can't thank you enough for joining us, for answering all of our questions, and for being an incredible resource. I will say, we sent an email out a few weeks ago, thanks to your leadership. And I know that thousands of people across the country and many, many hundreds in Massachusetts reached out to their legislators to get that $25 billion. We needed your leadership to help us write that email and help people.
But those actions are what made the difference. So thank everybody for your participation.
And what I would say in closing, as I move to thank yous, is I hope what folks take away from tonight is that we need to be plugged into what's happening federally, and Chris and I and our partners are going to try to help all of you understand that, but it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We need you all to write that email, to make that phone call, to help communicate some of these key messages, and we're going to be there. But I hope the takeaway is it's go time. And I just want to say thank you again to the Pioneer Valley Planning Council, to everyone who joined us across the country, and of course to Chris Dempsey at Transportation for Massachusetts for being our co-host tonight. We will be back next week, same time, 6 p.m. You can go to our website now to register, and we're going to be focusing on streets. We are going to dig into that issue. We are going to bring in experts from Chicago, likely from Oakland, to have a conversation about what is happening on our streets, what we can do. So if you're interested, sign back up, and we'll see you here next week.